Dr. Chadwick, did you find in your studies on religion that the church is growing and gaining strength in Muncie?
When we started our studies on religious behavior and religious attitudes, we were influenced by much of the media presentation that there'd been secularization occurring, that people were attending less, contributing less, and had a decline in their values concerning religion. And much to our surprise, we found that religion is alive and well, that the churches are growing, they're building new buildings, that the pews are full, and that people are contributing their income to support their churches.
You know, this study is very comprehensive and it encompassed several years of hard work on the part of several research scientists. Where do reports like the one concerning the church declining, lack of attendance, originate without the base of a real research project like this?
Unfortunately, they don't originate anywhere. Each year for the last 15 years, George Gallup has done a national survey on religious attitudes and religious attendance. And if one were to put those together, you start to see a trend appearing. But no one really does that, and so we end up with what appears in the popular media and taken at face value as being true. That's one of the strengths of this type of study, although also one of the things that's discouraging is it takes a doggone long to get anything out because you have to cross-check and integrate it with everything else. And as you say, we've been working at it for 4 or 5 years, and it's just been the last year or so that we've been able to release findings. So on the one hand, yes, by putting all that material together, we do feel comfortable and confident in making the statements that we do, but on the other hand, it slows up the process, and we'll be doing this for another 4 or 5 years before the full story is told.
In comparing your research with that of the Linds in their previous 2 studies, did you see any drastic change in religion?
Not drastic change. As mentioned, the Linds felt reasonably confident that as they looked at 1890 and then 1920, that there had been a serious decline in religion, that secularization was occurring, that people were moving from religion to science, and they were convinced that that would accelerate and that in another 20 years religion would be gone in Middletown. And what we found was that the churches are as full. We counted the number of churches and then divided by the number of people, so we end up with a per capita. There are actually more churches per people today than there were in 1920. We looked at church attendance. People actually go to church more frequently. We looked at their financial contributions. People give probably 3 times as much money, we're talking about in dollars, but in a percent of their family income today than they did in the early 1920s. The volume of religious materials that appear in bookstores and on radio and on television have all increased. Whatever indicator we looked at, we did not see any evidence of secularization. And in most, we saw actually a modest strengthening of the church. Even basic Christian values, we found, again, you would think we expected to find, most people would, given what the media said, a decline in basic religious beliefs. And that was not the case.
Is it true also, did you see strength in the non-Christian religions?
We didn't have enough people who were non-Christian to answer that question. There were very few Jewish respondents and a few non-Christians, primarily among college students at Ball State, but not enough to make any statements about. Muncie basically is a Christian community. Let me just say one thing about that. The one real difference we found in religion was a much greater tolerance for different religions. Back in 1924, it would have been hard for these non-Christian religions to function as they do today. Today, people feel as strongly about their religious beliefs, but they are more tolerant of people who have differing religious values and beliefs and
of
practices.
Course, when the Linds were here, we had a very strong Klan influence.
Had a very strong Klan influence, eh?
Another aspect of your study, your contribution to the Muncie Town study, was working and earning a living in Muncie.
Yes. A couple of things have emerged out of the analysis, and this is one of the stages that we're not as far along in analysis. But one thing that we found that was really exciting to us was that in the early 1920s, working class wives who were married to men who made their living with their hands, that 40% of these women were in the labor force. And when you looked at that same number today, 1978, it only increased 4% to 44%. So basically there hadn't been any change in their labor force participation. The change came in the business class wives of men who make their living with their mines and selling and so on, men who wear white shirts to work. Their wives were the ones who had gone out of the home and into the labor force, to where they had gone from 0% to about 41 or 42% in 1978. And that was really an exciting change to see a case where the business class pattern changed their life to fit the lifestyle of the working class.
Did you examine the reason for it?
Yes, we did, and in 1924, women worked primarily for economic reasons. Back in that age, when a man reached 40, 45, as his dexterity and his endurance declined, he often found himself unemployed. Or if he had an accident or became ill, the wife was pressed in to support the family, because there was no such thing as unemployment compensation, retirement, and all the things that we now have today. Today, women work for economic reasons, but there's a tremendous amount of working for self-fulfillment. Women would say, I work because it makes me a better person, it makes me a better wife, it makes me a better mother. I enjoy establishing adult relationships outside the home. I enjoy my work. I'm a better person for it. And we didn't get hardly any of that back in 1924. They worked out of economic necessity. Today, women work to help on the family income, but they also work for these other social and psychological reinforcements.
They find getting out in the workforce gives them a self-fulfilling usefulness that they didn't have.
Yes, and it was really interesting because the wives who were working said, I'm a better wife and I'm a better mother because of my working. But when you asked the husbands, the differences were never great, but they were always consistent. The husband whose wife worked wasn't quite as happy with his marriage, wasn't quite as satisfied, didn't think his wife was quite as good at all her wife roles as the man's wife who didn't work and was a full-time homemaker. Not a big difference, but a consistent one.
Did the husbands think their marriages were better?
The ones whose wives didn't work thought their marriages were better.
Good.
Let me.
Oh, that's all right. You got another point?
Just one other point I was going to make.
That's okay. Huh?
I wasn't running.
You haven't all this time. You haven't been running.
I'm going to do shot. The Linds, given their perspective, were concerned that with the automation that was occurring in the factories in the early 1900s, that men would become alienated from the work. They didn't use that word, but that's what they meant, that they would lose the pride in craftsmen and in the skills that it takes to produce good things. And that people then would become dissatisfied with their work and alienated from it. They wouldn't have that same pride. Well, they didn't collect any data on that, so we can't go back and compare, but there have been other studies in other communities for, about 25 or 30 years. And when we compare the job satisfaction of the men working in Middletown today, job satisfaction is as high, if not higher, than it's ever been. That automation has, to a large degree, freed the men of Middletown from the dangerous and the dirty work. And rather than divorce themselves from their product and make them dislike their occupation, it has improved it to the point where they're very satisfied with the income they make, with the working conditions, with the fringe benefits, with the colleagueship or friendships that they have on the job. So we didn't find any wholesale dissatisfaction because of factory life.
But I thought it kind of... Dr. Caplow, did the federal presence surprise you?
Well, the extent of it did. We knew, of course, that there had been a vast increase in the amount of federal participation in local life. We had no idea how much until we got into it. Astonishing. That, perhaps, is numerically the single most impressive change, because whereas the population has increased by a factor of about 3, the federal participation has increased by a factor of around 500.
And that has made a great change, has it, in the living and the standards?
No, it has had remarkably little effect.
Wait a minute. Dr. Caplow, were you surprised at the federal presence in your study?
Well, I think we were surprised at the extent of it. Muncie doesn't have a large federal establishment of a particularized kind, but there's no military base around here. There's no plant exclusively devoted to producing military equipment. There's no regional archives of the federal government. I mean, there's no particular reason for Muncie to have more than the sort of least common denominator of federal participation. But 123 programs is an impressive number, and the fact that the municipal government is now run for the most part on federal funds, and our estimate that more than 50% of the population receives a significant part of their subsistence on federal money, all very interesting. I think the two things that struck us most about the picture was that among the people we interviewed about the federal presence were a considerable number of federal employees or people who worked on local programs federally supported, like these regional planning councils. And none of them think of the federal government as we. They all think of the federal government as they. There are maybe some exceptions. There's a local office of the FBI where maybe they have some positive identification with Washington, but by and large, the people who happen to live on federal money never think of it in those terms. I mean, doctors who receive a large part of their income from Medicaid, or landlords who draw rent subsidies, or professors living on research grants, still think of the federal government as other people. And that's one reason why this enormous accumulation of funds and jobs doesn't really have much discernible local effect. The other reason seems to us to be a peculiar American invention whereby you distribute income, but you more or less proportion it to the original income. As the poor get a small subsidy, people of middle income get a middle-sized subsidy, the rich get big subsidies, and you therefore end up with a distribution which in terms of equality and inequality is exactly what it was in 1924. There's been no redistribution at all.
Dr. Caplow, how did you become interested in Middletown?
Well, it was the first book I ever read in sociology. It fascinated me. And then I thought nothing more about it. And in the summer of my sophomore year at Columbia, my friend Carl Elkin came down from Harvard to take a summer course, which he needed for some requirement. And the course was offered by Robert Lind, so I went along in a sociable way and listened to him lecture. And he's a marvelous lecturer. The only man I've ever heard from that day to this who would seriously stop, attend to students' comment, urge him to continue, and then take out his notebook and start taking notes. I've never seen any other instructor do that. And he was a wonderfully affable man in those days. And so I started hanging about his coattails and asking him a lot of questions. And finally, he sort of took me in hand and decided I would be a sociologist, and that was that. And then I didn't, curiously enough, he sent me to study with some people at the University of Chicago, and I didn't see him again for many years until he retired at Columbia in 1960, and I came back and took his place. And about 1965, I had a graduate student who was from Muncie, and we were talking about a dissertation for him, and I said, well, why don't you go back and have another look at Middletown, see what's happened. He thought that was a real good idea, so I approached Professor Lind and said, what do you think of this? He said, oh, you can't do that. He said, I'm going to do that myself. He was then about 76 and all crippled up with arthritis, but I didn't do it at the time. kept the idea in mind, and a few years later, when Barr and I had finished one set of projects and were looking for another, we decided it was about time to revisit Middletown.
How is the project financed?
National Science Foundation. Altogether, it's cost about $700,000 over a period of 5 years. I hope the money's been well spent.
That was my next question. How will your survey be used in the results of your
Well,
study?
we have already published about 25 papers in social science journals, and I would guess that before we're done, there will have been about 200 papers on all sorts of topics. The 25 papers involve 20 different authors because we have benefited from collaboration with people on the Ball State faculty. I think 5 of them figure as co-authors in various places, from colleagues at Virginia and at Brigham Young and other universities. And we've generally encouraged people to join the project and volunteer their particular talents. That's happened to a surprising extent. Some of our co-authors have never received a day's pay from the project, but they're still in there in an important sort of way.
Will the results of your survey directly benefit the people of America, Muncie, or any other community?
Well, if you think that knowledge does, yes. It's not what we call applied research. I do a fair amount of that. I'm doing a study now where we're looking at the Army Reserves and saying how can we improve this organization. That's a very different sort of thing. But most of us who are in sociology or related field believe that you really get...
Okay. You're going to write 30 books?
Oh, we hope about 3 or 4.
3 or 4.
What you're gathering here. I'm going to get out of the way so he can start out.
You ready, Jim?
Oh, ready, Ron. Okay. Now, is your study part of the Middletown study?
No, we're a separate study. We have a separate funding. We're funded by NIMH, and they're funded by NSF.
Will you pursue... Yeah, would you spell that?
Yes, the National Institute for Mental Health, as opposed to the National Science Foundation.
Why are they funding you rather than the National Science Foundation, which funded the Muncie Town study?
Well, we simply submitted it to the NIMH rather than to NSF, because they were handling and dealing with funding involving studies of the sort, community-based studies.
Now, will your research be just in the black area and...
Solely in the black area. We are concerned, first of all, and we have completed about 185 oral histories with elderly blacks in the community. That began in early June. And we're now in the second phase of collecting newspaper clippings, collecting diaries, collecting church histories, collecting letters, and the community has been very responsive to that. The third phase, which I'm about to embark upon, is the data collecting stage. We'll be sending questionnaires throughout the community. We'll have maybe about 4 separate questionnaires, one on religion, one on earning a living, community relations, and what have you.
Do you feel that the Linds were neglected the black part of Muncie in their studies?
Well, they did so by intent. They intended not to study the black community because they intended to study a community which they felt was a very homogeneous community without many foreigners, without many blacks. So therefore it made sense for them to do it that way. This was their intent.
And then your study, of course, is going to be a reference point for future studies.
That's right. That's right. How the role that blacks have played in Muncie. And we're going back to look at migratory patterns. That is, why did blacks come to Muncie? What were the conditions in Kentucky, Mississippi, Louisiana before coming here? And what were the conditions they met when they got here? Which is a very important thing. So we're setting up a base now for looking at the black community historically as well as in futuristic terms.
Of course, there was a very small percentage of blacks in the Muncie community in the 20s.
Yes, about 5-6%.
This increased in the 30s, and of course, today we have about 10%.
About 10%, right. It's been very consistent from the 30s on.
You have just started your studies.
That's right.
How long will you be in the community?
I will be there until the end of July of next year.
Do you have any definite conclusions? Is it too early for any?
Much too early. Much too early.
What?
Except one thing I think is very clear, and that is the community, many persons in the community are very much aware of the fact that blacks were not studied by in the previous studies. And because of that reason, they've been maybe overly eager to help us with our study.
What is the reception, your reception among the blacks in this study?
I think it's been very, very good. We have been, or they have shown me all the hospitality I could ever imagine. They've taken me into their churches, their homes, their organizations. It's been simply very, very good. Very good.
You made a point at a previous meeting that I attended when you said whites are never used to interview blacks. Blacks are not used to interview whites. Would you get a good response if a black were interviewing a white, or would you get the response you wanted, an honest?
No, I said that whites have traditionally been studying blacks, but we have no studies of blacks studying whites. And I said there was some opposition to that point.
That's
and
exactly
this
right.
was regrettable.
Yes.
Right. Since the 1960s, with the emergence of black consciousness and black power, what have you, blacks have become increasingly suspicious of whites coming into their community. So therefore, from the 1960s on, we've had much more resistance by blacks to whites coming to black communities, and much more positive response from the community by blacks coming in to study the community. And this is reflective of the growing suspicion we've seen over the past 15 or more years.
Do you think this is an attitude that will change?
Well, it will change if conditions change. I think the attitudes result from the very real political and economic conditions under which people labor. And the attitude won't change until people change, until the conditions of people change.
Is it too early to tell whether blacks fare differently in the Muncie community than they would in a comparable community?
Oh, yes, much too early. Much too early.
When do you expect to publish your results?
We're now anticipating some publications, probably the end of 1981. Now that seems so far away, but when you're doing it, it's almost like tomorrow.
Good. Thank you very much.
You're quite welcome.
Appreciate it.
I gave you some information.
Well, you can't give me too much. You gave me, we really wanted to know about the
Touch
study.
with you again, because when we start